Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Felix Shipkevich, and I'm delighted to kick off our 2022 webinar series. And today, on February 16th, we're kicking off with a very interesting subject matter, one that I wanted to do for quite a long time. But I wasn't able to do so until we had a criminal attorney with extensive background in criminal law join our practice. And a couple of months ago, a colleague of mine, Melanie Trogolo, joined our firm as a senior attorney, and I'll let Melanie introduce herself in a few minutes. And we're delighted to have Melanie assist us and help us to discuss a very interesting subject matter, the white-collar crime issues in the debt relief space, debt relief industry. I want to say a big thank you to those of you who are continuing to be our followers of webinars and continuing to educate yourself. For those of you who are new, thank you for joining. And we hope you could receive more information about the legal and regulatory issues concerning the debt relief space on our firm's website, debtreliefwatch.com. Without further ado, let's begin. So here's a little agenda today. And the agenda is quite simple. What I'd like to do is I'd like for Melanie and I to discuss just the 5 areas concerning criminal law implications concerning the debt relief space. First, we're going to talk about what exactly is white-collar crime. I know that most of you probably have watched all these television shows that depict both violent and nonviolent crimes, but I'm sure everybody has heard of the infamous case from almost 20 years ago involving Martha Stewart, and when she went to prison and when she was teaching all the fellow prisoners to, I believe, saw and bake in prison. And one of my other favorite ones is Orange is the New Black. I thought that was kind of a nice show, at least for the first 2 seasons. And so today, we're going to talk about how people get in trouble with the law beyond the civil liability, beyond violating the telemarketing sales rule, UDAP, get locked up. Melanie will talk about the sentencing guidelines. We'll talk about some of the cases involving debt settlement industry and when people were arrested. Now, what's different about today's webinar is that we're not going to talk about TSR or some of the civil issues that we typically discuss during our webinar series. In fact, today we're going to focus on why did some people get arrested? What did they do? And what pushed those cases go from the civil side to the criminal side? And ultimately, when does one's conduct lead to potential criminal prosecution? So I think we have a pretty interesting agenda, and let me turn over the mic to my colleague Melanie, and she'll introduce herself.
Thank you, Felix. So I am Melanie. I have been focusing my practice in criminal law for the last few years. I have dealt mostly with violent offenses, from aggravated robberies to murders, first-degree murders. So it's just kind of everything in between. I've also worked federal cases as well. Those mostly are trafficking or sex crimes. Specialty finance is something I've always wanted to do. And truly, when you're focusing on a white-collar crime and you're looking for an attorney for that kind of, charge, basically, you want to focus on somebody that has a background within your field. They do give you these massive discovery packets that have all of their evidence that charges against you, all the evidence that they have that they're going to present against you. And if you go to someone that focuses on state crimes, they're not going to know how a corporation works, what regulatory, conditions they should be looking at that you allegedly violated that led you to where you are. So it's important to have somebody that has a background. And Felix, this is a specialty. So I figured this was a perfect way to kind of marry both areas and get results for our clients, because we understand not just the criminal aspect of it, but also the actual compliance and being able to understand the documents that are being presented.
Thanks, Melanie. And Melanie joined a firm just a couple of months ago, and she's already been working on a number of matters on the civil side with her debt relief clients. I'm very excited that she joined us because I can't tell you how often I get asked the question from clients and potential clients or the conferences. Well, why did this case go to criminal prosecution? What pushed it over the edge, right? And so we'll talk about that today. I'm not going to really talk too much about myself, but I've been an attorney for 2 decades. I teach law on the side at Hofstra Law. I taught courses like corporate finance, and for the past now 4 years, I've been teaching a course on the regulation of cryptocurrencies. It is my passion, and keeping my fingers crossed that hopefully sometime in middle of this year I'll finish my textbook on the regulation of cryptocurrencies. Anyway, I'll move on. I don't really like to talk too much about myself, but so Melanie, let's talk about what is white collar crime. I mean, you put in the definition in this presentation, but why don't I open the floor to you? Why don't you basically tell the audience what is white collar crime and basic kind of high level information.
Of course. And it really is a nonviolent crime. And it's usually, involves people within a business that have access to be able to commit criminal offenses while they're working in a corporation. And individuals can obviously be charged with white collar crime, but so can corporations. It just involves different types of penalties, of course. And I believe we have a slide as well with just some examples, kind of what you would consider normally when you think of white collar crime.
Okay. Tell us some of the examples when you were working for the state, some of the, and also private practice, what are some of the violent crimes as an example?
So, of course, violent crimes are very typical, at least in my area, there was a high crime area, armed robberies, attempted murders, first degree murders, kidnapping. So those are basically like the basic ones that would involve violence. Of course, they come down to nonviolent as well when it comes to drug trafficking, which at that point can go over to federal when they cross state lines. So there's just like an array of different crimes, but my focus was definitely mostly on violent offenses.
And I remember when you joined the firm, you were showing to me some of these letters and postcards that you still get from the clients that you represented. I think one of them has a bake shop, right? Correct, in where you live?
Yeah, he does. I actually still keep in touch with him, and he is selling pound cakes, and he was charged with armed robbery, or not armed robbery. He actually wasn't armed, but he had a mask on, which is an aggravated factor, and he broke into the same house multiple times. They offered him 10 years. He scored 8, which you guys will understand a little bit in a second of what I mean. He scored 8, what that means, and we were able to get him out on probation. So he lives to sell another pound cake, and he's doing great.
Well, that's always a good story. I always think it's interesting. So when I teach my class at Hofstra Law, and obviously for those of you who know me, I came to the debt relief space about 7 years ago. But for almost 2 decades, I've been representing banks, technology companies, fintech companies, some of them, more speculative products. And, I've had a few share of clients that over the years ended up went to prison. And one of my favorite stories is, and then of course, by no shape or form am I encouraging to commit any crime, but I had a client who used to make millions of dollars a month and spent a few years at Fort Dix Penitentiary, which is a camp where they play tennis and they play video games. They have a library, you can get a degree. It's not what you see on television shows. And I always thought it was kind of really wrong how somebody who stole tens of millions of dollars from innocent consumers went to prison for a few years and enjoying his life now versus somebody who might have gotten, an aggravated assault, right? And then ended up being locked up for, in high security prison. So.
Oh yeah, definitely. We call them Club Fed.
Club Fed, right? That's an interesting one, right? So, by the way, for those of you who know my webinars, I don't typically do them in a very legalese way because the last thing that I want to do is continue with the notion that attorneys are boring and just will teach you the law and then it's you to fall asleep. No, so we actually make them. I always like to tell my stories anyway. So basically, look, white collar crime, non-violent crimes committed by individuals or companies, and um, I'm sure you've seen tons of movies, or television shows. My favorite one is The Wolf of Wall Street. One of my favorite ones. I think it's an amazing movie,
That's a great movie.
and especially at the very end when you see him, on the tennis courts, um, and he recently moved just a few miles away from me in Miami. So,
Yep.
so life isn't that bad when you commit white collar crime. No, I'm not saying that. I'm being a little facetious. Okay, so let's move over to the possible reasons for lack of prosecution, right? So the question that I get asked constantly is, you,
Felix, I think we lost you. Okay, I think you're back.
Okay. Actually, I think it seems to me my earpiece disconnected. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I guess in the world of using Zoom, we do have.
Oh, we're losing you again.
We're losing me again. Okay.
Okay, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. All right. Great. So sorry about that. Well, technical issues, right? Well, if they happen at Super Bowl, they could happen on Zoom meet, right? Okay. Anyway, okay. So possible reasons for lack of prosecutions, right? So what actually causes for the case to be referred to U.S. Attorney's Office or District Attorney's Office? What pushes something over the edge, right? And that's a very, very big question that I get asked all the time. I can't tell you if I had $1 for every time a client asked me, oh, I think I made a mistake, right? And generally speaking, right, if you look on a state and federal level, you don't have that many cases that end up being prosecuted by law enforcement authorities. And the reason for that, the biggest reason, right? And I'm not basically encouraging anybody who's listening to this to say, wow, I have nothing to worry about. No, you do have something to worry about if you did something egregious, but ultimately it comes down to resources, right? And resources and the type of political motivation by both state, local, or federal authorities, right? If you look at DAs get elected. U.S. attorneys get appointed, right? You get appointed, and typically the U.S. attorneys in this respective district get appointed based on the political party affiliation who's in control. It
Okay, well, while Felix is gone, I'm going to continue that train of thought. And he is correct. A lot of times, political affiliation does have a lot to do with it. Can you come? Are you there?
Okay. Looks like I'm continuing to have all these issues. Okay, so hold on a second. I mean, this is I apologize. 1 second. Let me try to see. You can still hear me, correct, Melanie?
Yes.
All right. Let me. I'll turn off my earpiece. I guess that was the problem. So when you look at most of these cases, it doesn't. It's not that the cases could not be of interest to federal, state, or local prosecutors. It's the fact is whether they have enough resources and enough manpower to prosecute these cases. A lot depends on what type of caliber of prosecutors that they have. As an example, I've worked pretty closely with a number of attorneys negotiating deals with Manhattan DA's office. And Manhattan DA's office has an entire department devoted to financial crimes, an entire department. And that department is quite significant. If I'm not mistaken, just in the county of New York, which is the island of Manhattan, you have close to something like 50 attorneys that are dedicated to financial crimes. That's a pretty significant number of attorneys. If I go to towns in the U.S. like Cleveland or Cincinnati or Austin, they also have financial crimes attorneys in the district attorney's office, but you only have a handful, right? The U.S. Attorney's Office generally will handle more financial crimes than district attorney's offices, but then you also have to be mindful that, again, U.S. attorney's offices, which part of the Department of Justice, have violent crimes to deal with, terrorism, money laundering. So it's not capable and able to take on every single case that could potentially be of interest. I don't necessarily want anybody to get excited and to say, well, I'm not really concerned here because I'm small potatoes. From time to time, they will find a scapegoat, and from time to time, they will go after someone because, well, you just happen to be that person or that company. And we'll actually go through one of the examples, which I thought was kind of an interesting example later on in this webinar. But let's see, Melanie, why don't I turn it over to you? I kind of hogged the mic a little bit too much while my mic was not working very well.
Of course. So Felix is correct. For example, when people are running on a certain platforms, there are certain crimes that they promise that they're going to go, prosecute and to the fullest extent of the law. And so you see sometimes a little bit of a focus on certain crimes due to that political, power kind of being behind that. Also, one of the things that he said, not enough resources, it is a huge one. I can't tell you how many times as an attorney I used that to my advantage. If I knew that the government had a certain number of cases that were lined up for trial in a certain week, I would push something for trial a certain week so they would drop my cases, because sometimes I knew that they had bigger fish to fry. So why not give my guy a deal so you can lighten your load? So those are things that you can obviously use as an attorney to your advantage. But sometimes also it kind of, I guess the best way to describe it would be when you see, little drug dealers on the corner being arrested, and you don't see, the Pablo Escobars of the world being arrested at the beginning. It's kind of the same way. Sometimes they'll go against a small fish just to get information. And that information leads them to somebody else that's violating something a little bit more seriously than you are. And then that leads them to the next person. And so sometimes the cooperation will be a reason that they don't prosecute you, because you're giving them something better to be able to, put their hands into. Also, it depends on the amount of money sometimes. If you have someone committing a crime that's worth $500,000 versus someone that's defrauded people for $20 million, obviously the $20 million is going to cause more attention, as well as length of criminal activities. Some people aren't caught until much later in life. They've been doing the same criminal activities for 10, 15 years before their luck runs out. That's also a big focus. When it's something, the corruption's so widespread that the prosecutor just cannot ignore it, that's usually when those, start coming down on you. One of the big things is a lot of times you kind of have a heads up when you're being investigated, and you have the ability at that time to kind of speak to the prosecutors and maybe potentially stop charges from being brought by being able to divulge information or explain away some things that they're focusing on. But that's also a time that you may not know somebody else is being investigated because they've been dealing with the prosecutor prior to charges being filed. So that could also help your case out for prosecution purposes. But mostly it comes down to when you refuse to cooperate with investigations, they usually will try to attack you to make an example out of you. But if you cooperate, try to throw out your evidence before the charges are brought, you have a better chance of being able to avoid prosecution at times. Felix, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, no, thanks, Melanie. I appreciate that. This is really good commentary. And I know that some of you are listening right now and saying, well, what is that silver bullet, right? What is exactly the reason that pushes a case from civil to criminal? And the answer is, yeah, look, there's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand, right? It's a case by case basis. And I have to tell you that I've been involved in civil cases involving allegations of hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. And those cases were never referred to law enforcement authorities, or maybe they were referred, but they weren't taken, not prosecuted. There were no indictments issued. And I've had actually, I have to now going back even 10 years ago, when Dodd-Frank was enacted, I had clients that were, I have a client a gentleman I represented who was running a technology company from Austin, Texas, barely made any money, but he was the low-hanging fruit for potential criminal prosecution, just because of his dealings with somebody else who was this global criminal, and he was the low-hanging fruit because of jurisdictional reasons to bring in the other parties to the U.S. So anyway, I hope I don't disappoint you, and Melanie didn't disappoint you, but it's a very, very fact specific and resources specific. So why don't we move on, right? And the next slide is, look, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's really no reason to go into it. These are examples of white-collar crime, identity theft, counterfeiting, bankruptcy fraud, government fraud, securities fraud. And I mean, of course, these are more of the mainstream examples. But we figured we might as well give it to the the audience. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie again, and I want Melanie to discuss as an example what some of the punishment or what the definition of bank fraud, for instance. So why don't you go ahead, Melanie?
Of course. So, like I said, white collar crime is not just against an individual; it can be against a corporation as well. However, obviously, you cannot put a corporation in jail. So that would be mostly with fines or restrictions on what they can and cannot do. So that's how a corporation would be criminally prosecuted. However, when the individuals get involved, there are statutes that kind of guide you, basically. And so, for example, this one right here is for bank fraud. These are called elements. So basically, the prosecutor has to meet all of the elements in order to be able to charge you with it. And then at the end of it, it says it shall be fined with not more than $1 million or imprisoned for not more than 30 years or both. So the maximum you can get for this crime is 30 years and $1 million fine. So every single charge has statute that you would be able to look at to decide how you'll get punished and the fines involved. So that's basically how this is. However, this will kind of continue on to the sentencing guidelines, which I don't think a lot of people understand how those work and how the prosecutors sometimes come up with their sentence, the quote unquote offer that they first give you when you are arrested. Did you want to go to the next slide, Felix?
Sure.
So a score sheet is what the state and federal government basically uses in order to calculate how you'll be punished. This is how they're going to decide what, like I said, an offer is what they call it, what an offer is to be given. So every single charge has points. You want, for example, let's just throw out a number. Let's just say that murder is a level 1 offense, and so that is the most severe, and that means that you have to be given between 30 to life. So that will be calculated within the score sheets in order to determine what sentence they're going to offer you. So score sheets also have what's called enhancements. So for example, if you had a weapon, if you had a mask, if you injured somebody, the severity of their injuries are counted for points in order to determine your sentence. And sometimes it can, basically score you out to mandatory prison. So if your score sheet scores you to a certain number, then that means that you have no choice but to go to prison unless the judge gives you a downward departure, which I'll go into that in a second. But there's also certain crimes that have minimum mandatories. Like, for example, certain gun crimes. If you have a gun in your possession, you have a minimum sentence you must serve. Drug trafficking, that also has, different types of levels of minimums. That's in Florida. I'm not sure about other states, but in Florida, we do have a minimum. So it doesn't matter if you have no prior history, as long as you're caught with a gun, there's certain time that you must complete in prison unless you get a downward departure, which can be done, but it is difficult. Now, score sheets are not required to be followed, but it's harder to appeal a sentence that's considered reasonable, and it's reasonable if it's based on a guideline. So judges try to stay within those guidelines when they figure out their sentencing. That way they can provide a quote unquote reasonable offer, because everyone, usually typically appeals their sentences when they're not happy with them. Now, basically what I was talking about was downward departure. So a downward departure is essentially when a judge decides to go below what you quote unquote score. And I'm going to show you guys a score sheet on the next slide too, so you can see what I'm talking about. But for example, some of the things that would be included in a judge deciding to go below, thank you, Felix, to go below the guidelines would be if someone's cooperated with the government. And how that works is this: the government will tell you, hey, we're going to give you a deal if you cooperate with us, but we cannot guarantee your deal until the trial's over. Because, of course, a defense attorney would immediately use that in court and say, hey, have you been promised something in return for your testimony? So they avoid giving out promises on what your sentence will be until your cooperation is complete. So that is a reason why you might get a lighter sentence. Your individual role in the crime, it's not the same if you're the person that had the gun versus the person that stood outside. Even though you guys are all prosecuted together with the same charges, it's not the same involvement. If you accept responsibility for a crime, that is considered one of the downward departures in federal court. If you were coerced to complete your action, and basically just the totality of the circumstances. They look at the whole crime in general. So those are some of the reasons that a judge may consider reducing your sentence. However, they can also do what is an upward departure, where they go above your sentencing guidelines. So if you were already being investigated for something else, they can take that into consideration. If you have prior similar conduct that did not result in criminal convictions, they can do the same thing. They can also take that into consideration. Or any prior sentences that you've served that are a year or longer, which is basically prison sentences, they'll consider that as well. Felix, would you mind clicking on the first score sheet?
It's actually not opening up, but that was actually one of my questions to you. Should I, if I'm listening to this webinar or I have a friend that is fearing, should I just like print out and fill out this score sheet myself, or it's kind of a silly process?
The score sheets are actually very helpful to understand. And honestly, I've actually dealt with many attorneys that don't know how to properly score a score sheet, including prosecutors, which has actually helped me. And sometimes because they don't add certain enhancements that they should be adding. For example, when you violate probation, they should be adding points, and a lot of them did not realize that. But it's a good thing to have. And it starts off with basically your most serious charge. And in the second page, you can't see it, but at the very bottom box, they have you add up the points, subtract, and then multiply, and that will give you your sentence basically that they would offer you. And then at the third page, they would add all your previous convictions. Now, they also have something called a pre-sentence investigation if you've never had a felony before, where they'll kind of conduct some research into your background, your family history, work history, and then they'll be able to show that to the judge in order to consider possibly lightening the sentence. Because once that's only the first time you become a felon. After that, you're not entitled to that anymore. But there are things that are mitigating in your sentencing that an attorney can present on your behalf. For example, let's just do something simple like a DUI. I have had a couple realtors with DUIs. And one of the mitigating things that I can offer is their license, because obviously a DUI, you get a license suspension. So when you have a license suspension, that kind of keeps you from being able to conduct your business as a realtor. How are you supposed to go see, do showings? How are you supposed to go do open houses? And the laws have changed a little bit here locally. Now you're automatically entitled to a hardship, but that wasn't the case before. So that's something that you're able to present to the prosecutor to try to get a rec list, so that way your license is not suspended and you don't have a DUI on your record and you can continue working as a realtor. So there are things like that that can help mitigate your sentence. It's just a matter of putting in the time of gathering all that information to help. And that can do the same thing with, white collar crimes. There are certain things that you want to present on your behalf of your clients, so you can help them with the sentence and reduce their sentences and not have to, if you don't want to go to trial, at least that way you can try to help mitigate that. And a lot of times, when it's a first offense, depending on the seriousness of it, it's not a mandatory prison sentence. So you are able to kind of play with the mitigation and kind of help creatively resolve things. So there are creative resolutions you could do as opposed to, imprisonment. You could do like home detention or certain programs. Once again, just use a simple DUI. I would have a couple of my clients sometimes volunteer at AA classes. That way they were getting the benefit of the AA classes as well as volunteering, and they loved that. Or, volunteering with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So sometimes just little creative resolutions kind of can help you get away from having to actually go to prison.
Let me ask you another question. What are these score sheets publicly available?
Yeah, anyone can Google a score sheet. There's also, like I said, every crime has a level offense and a point. So that is how you would calculate it. So it's all actually readily available. It's just a matter of understanding how to actually complete the form. Because there are, like I said, there are aggravating factors that you would have to add points for, and then you calculate your sentence.
Okay, let's say as an example, I'm the CFPB, or I am California DFPI, and I'm investigating a case that I believe may have some serious wrongdoings. Am I able to request, if I see that an individual I'm investigating has a prior, am I able to pull the prior score sheet? Am I able to get a copy of that file?
I mean, I'm assuming as a state regulator, you'd probably be able to contact them for that. But I don't know. I mean, they will definitely be able to pull up your criminal history, obviously. I mean, and it's pretty much very easily accessible to have someone's criminal history unless it's a juvenile conviction. But I'm sure the state agencies well, I'm not sure. I know that a lot of them will cooperate with each other to help them give stuff that may not be readily available to others.
So essentially, if it's not under seal, you should assume that if you have a prior, right, even like a DUI, right, that it's possible that the regulator on the civil side may get access to it just because it's a matter of public record, correct? Unless it's been
Yeah.
under seal. Okay.
I mean, even discovery requests, how reporters are able to get so much information on cases, all of your discovery is actually subject to, you can go request it. It's public information. So if you have a case you're interested in, you are more than welcome to go request the discovery and have access to it. There are some stuff that will be blocked out, such as, personal identifying information or addresses, but everything else is public. People can go access your case and figure out what the discovery that is being handled. And that is a lot of times how reporters are able to get information on cases they're reporting on.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I know that unfortunately in this slide, I'm not able to magnify those 3 pages, but if you send me an email, myself or Melanie could forward you the actual score sheet. Obviously, it's quite a lot of information and hopefully useful information to you. But we'll be happy to share the score sheets, and if you want to play around with them and have a score sheet party, at your next Christmas party, you could kind of have Santa fill out your score sheet. I'm kidding. I'm just, I always like to bring a little bit of humor into the legal space. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on, because I could see the people. It's interesting. We actually have more people who've joined our webinar since we began. Half an hour ago. Despite some technological issues about 10 minutes ago. Anyway, let's talk about some of the examples of criminal prosecution in the debt relief industry. And let me sort of preface that we selected a couple of cases. Melanie selected these cases, and the information we're going to discuss is the public information. It's our opinion is that of our firm as attorneys, and I know this sounds more like a government disclaimer, when they say that the opinion is mine. But the reality is these are pretty serious cases, and what we've done is when selecting these cases, and I'm gonna hand the mic over again back to Melanie. I want to focus specifically on the criminal side, and I want to underline and highlight this, bold it, whatever you want to call it. We're not talking about, again, the TSR issues or UDAP issues or failure to be licensed, or we're strictly focusing on what pushed these cases over the edge. Why were they referred to federal prosecution or state prosecution authorities? So please, Melanie, let's talk about the Mission debt settlement case.
Of course. So I actually chose one that's already been resolved, one that was basically prosecuted, but it only ended up in fines. And this one actually had multiple people involved, so you can see the differences in their sentencing, which is always interesting to see. But basically, the allegations were they had $6.6 million in fees that they received from consumers, and they took upfront fees, which we all know is a big no-no. They also promised things, which is on the next slide, that just a credit score increase, and there was no data to back it up. They also used a lot of deceptive solicitation letters in order to pretend that they were part of organizations that they were not a part of. And so they were intentionally misleading consumers. So what I find interesting in this one is actually the very next slide, which is the outcome. So here are 5 different, employees who were charged for the same crime, but yet you see the stark difference in how they were sentenced. The owner obviously probably had the most liability. He got 9 years in prison. The $2.2 million they're alleged to have, taken from consumers, they all had to pay together along with mission. So basically, he was ordered a fine, 9 years. The second employee only got probation along with community service hours and restitution. Now, I obviously cannot say that he was a quote unquote snitch, and because I don't know, I've never worked this case, but a lot of times, someone that is more cooperative will get the best sentence. Or they weren't as involved as others. So the third employee only got a year sentence, followed by 3 years of probation and with the restitution. Fourth employee, 18 months, and the fifth employee, 24 months. So all of them ended up with probation afterwards, which is pretty common. It's less common of lengthier sentences, but still can happen. And of course, they all had to pay the money back they were alleged to have taken from these consumers. But it's always interesting to see how there is such a huge gap between one person getting probation and one person getting 9 years in prison for the same allegations.
And let me add a few other comments about this specific case. I actually know personally, that's what I should say, no, personally, I've met one of the individuals who was in prison, not the owner, but another individual. I could tell you this case is interesting at multiple levels for me as a civil attorney, as a regulatory attorney. First of all, if you actually look at the totality of the amount at issue, it's $2.2 million. Now, I know that to many people, to most of Main Street America, $2.2 million is not, it's not a small amount of money. But, for financial crimes, based on two decades of experience, it's probably in the lower end of financial crimes that have come across my desk. And
yes,
it's not a huge number. The second thing, which is kind of interesting here, is that somebody had 9 years in prison, right? And he was incarcerated. He was sent, actually, the owner, to, this is one of those, again, camps at upstate New York. I think it's Monticello. He's a lawyer. He was disbarred. And he, from what I know, some of the information that I have publicly available, he's doing like a radio show right now in New York City, in the Russian community. But what's interesting is that 9 years is a long time to be put away. And there's a question of whether or not, right, there's a sort of this philosophical question, but it's an interesting question of whether or not 9 years is really the proper amount of time that was handed down. And the short answer is, to some people, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York, and at that point, 2013, it was run by one of the most aggressive prosecutors, Bahara, who ended up actually resigning shortly after Trump took office. But he was very aggressive, and when this case came down, I wasn't part of the debt relief industry. I was still, working with fintech companies and banks. And when I heard this case, I said, this doesn't make any sense for somebody to be going to prison for 9 years over 2.2 million restitution with other defendants. And then some people went to 18 months, 24 months. I get it, the fact that there were supervised releases and all that kind of stuff, but still, that's pretty egregious. That seemed to me that this case was very politically motivated. And I just, almost a decade later, discussing this case makes me cringe a little bit, because it's not the fact that as an attorney, as a practitioner, and, as someone who's in academia, I don't think that somebody should go to prison. In fact, they do. But the fact that, 9 years, that seems a little bit egregious. And unnecessary, but it is what it is. And so again, the focus of today's webinar is to focus specifically on some of the cases that we've selected for you, and just to have a candid discussion about what potentially could happen, right? And even though about 30 minutes ago or so, I was discussing that, well, how federal and state prosecutors may not have the necessary authority, necessary resources, right, to prosecute every single case. But here's an example of a case, and it's a, it's a legitimate criminal case. I'm not undermining the legitimacy of it, but here's an example of where you could clearly see that, this was definitely one that, at least in my opinion, was a little bit more politically driven than, in fact, in substance. I mean, anyway, let's kind of move on to the next case.
But no, it's true, and that also brings up another point: is you never know what prosecutor you're going to have, what judge you're going to have, and that can make all of the difference. There are some, excuse my casual language, but basically there was one judge we called. Well, I didn't call him, but everyone called her Judge Hug-a-Thug, because she essentially gave extremely light sentences. Doesn't matter what you did. You could have his mom stand up there and say, "My son's a great kid," even though he robbed somebody at gunpoint, and she would eat it up. But yet you have others. There was another judge that everyone called Hang 'em Healy, because he just slammed everybody in his courtroom. So it just really depends, like you said, political reasons, judges, prosecutors. There's certain judges that just have no tolerance for certain crimes, for whether it be personal reasons, or whatever the reason may be. And just because you happen to end up in that courtroom with that judge, you're going to get slammed, and as opposed to being with a different judge. So it really just depends. And that's something that you also have to consider. You don't know where you're going to end up, and you don't know what judge you're going to end up with.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And also, we have to be mindful that I think that we forget that prosecutors are people too, and they have,
Correct.
their background, their upbringing, their political motivations have a pretty big part. And that's what makes, in my opinion, right? I'm not a white collar crime attorney. I'm a civil lawyer, but that's what, as a civil lawyer, it's always difficult to predict whether or not a certain case is going to go over to the criminal side. It's you kind of rolling the dice that you kind of, if you're in the wrong, if your client's in the wrong, hopefully, they won't get prosecuted. And if they do, they better think about, analyze, and hence why attorneys like Melanie, in my opinion, complements our firm's practice, the fact that they will analyze who the audience is, who the judge is, who the prosecutor, what background they have, how many cases they've tried, and what is the general direction of that prosecutor and that judge. And these are kind of the elements that they don't teach in law school. They don't teach you that you kind of have to do a lot of this analysis and really see whether or not some of these cases are, being prosecuted a little bit more aggressively than others. For those of you who are civil lawyers on this, and I know that there are a few attorneys who, my colleagues, that we also see the same thing on dealing with state AGs and state regulators and the CFPB and the FTC in this space. It depends who gets a case, right? It depends who's prosecuting, and we're involved in multiple CFPB investigations at this time, and I mean, you have sort of this night and day scenarios between some of the enforcement attorneys with the CFPB. Some are very easy to talk to, and then they don't take things personally, and while others are just really taking it at a very personal level, and that same mentality goes into the criminal side as well.
Correct.
Right? And again, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I imagine, Melanie, right, you probably had attorneys on the other side, prosecutors who were aggressive because they just were taking their power to the next level, right? It was too personal for them.
Way too personal. And there's some that had very conservative backgrounds and upbringings, and everything to them was extremely serious. Like everything was the end of the world to them. So they prosecuted things extremely harshly. And then you had others that understood that people make mistakes, and they were more willing to work with you. And you just never know what you're going to get. And that's part of just being in practice, is learning your judges, learning your prosecutors, and understanding what is going to help your client and what's just going to destroy them.
Yep. So let's talk about a Reed Financial Group. This was a case from a few years ago, and why don't you discuss that a little bit?
So this one's actually also interesting because it was kind of similar in nature to the other one. They had upfront fees. They were deceiving their clients. And this one actually was interesting because they were student loan forgiveness programs. Anyone can go handle their own student loan forgiveness and sign up for it. Anyone can put their account into forbearance or consolidate their loans. That's not something you need an organization for. And they would promise these people to enroll them in these programs that's accessible to them, and they actually were placing their loans in a temporary forbearance or deferment without the consumer knowing. I don't think this one got very far, as far as I know. I don't think it happened for too long, but they ended up being fined $835,000, and they were had to forfeit all of their frozen funds that were held. So basically, I didn't see any arrest out of this one. It was mostly just the corporation.
Okay. Should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, this one was just an example of how sometimes the corporations can get prosecuted.
Okay.
Now, this one, I do have to give the government disclaimer, Felix. I'm sorry, but we do because it is still ongoing. So everything here is alleged, and there is nothing that we're saying that is a fact because they have not been tried in a court of law. So as of right now, they're innocent until proven guilty.
But this certainly is a criminal case that were brought against companies, corporates, right?
Yes, and
And
the owners.
This is what I call my second home, Orange County, the mecca of the debt relief space. I'm just being funny about it. But yeah, this came out about what 5-6 months ago. The indictment,
Yes.
September, and I've had a bunch of calls since then. And when our firm had our annual in-person debt relief industry training that we do in Orange County, we discussed the allegations. Again, these are just allegations. We're not in a position to discuss any outcome, but you could see that, this is a case brought on a local level, right? Unlike the Mission case, which was brought specifically on the federal level by U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, and then you have the Reed case, which was brought by the state, and then here you have the Orange County prosecutor DA's office. So you could see the difference.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the outcome. But yeah, 87 counts in the indictment. They really went at them.
Yeah, that's pretty serious. I'll be honest with you. That's pretty serious, and we're definitely following to see the outcome of this case, and definitely quite interesting. So, for the sake of time, we're actually 50 minutes into this. I said this was going to be one that's that webinar I've been looking forward to for a long time. And by the way, just as a side note, we do get requests for webinars, and we have a list, and we discuss them internally. So if you think would like us to discuss a specific topic, we're always happy to put it on the agenda for one of our webinars. Okay, Melanie, you want to kind of wrap this up? We're towards the end of.
I think my biggest takeaway for this is also people, I mean, as an attorney, you would not believe the amount of phone calls, and I know you get it, Felix, but for our listeners, the amount of phone calls that you get from everybody that even just has met you one time saying, hey, I have this that's going on in my life. Can you help me with this? And I'm like, hi, I don't practice that area of law. And they can't seem to comprehend that as a lawyer, you don't know every topic in the entire universe. So it's so important that if you do come across these issues, that you have an attorney that has the knowledge, because state crimes and federal crimes are completely different. Someone that specializes in DUIs and petty theft is not going to know how to be able to review this discovery and not just focus on the law, but also focus on what is right and what is wrong, where the prosecutors are going wrong, where the holes in their evidence are. And that's something that somebody that has the background in these businesses would know. So that's something that's very important to know. Not every lawyer is the same. You would not go and get a DUI and go to a real estate attorney to help you with that charge. That would just not be very smart. So that's something that I wanted to just kind of really focus, because everyone seems to think that just because you're an attorney, you can talk about every subject under the sun. And that's just not the case.
Yeah, this brings me to another story. I have a client we represented who was prosecuted by FINRA. This was a two-year case before FINRA, by FINRA file against this registered rep. And it was a terrible case. I mean, the client, he was eventually thrown out of the securities industry. And 2 months later, a couple of months later, we get a call and, hi, I was just arrested by the FBI. Can you help me? I'm like, oh. And this is actually just a little before Melanie joined the firm. And I said, no, I can't help you. He's like, well, that was my one attorney phone call to make. I said, I get it, but I'm a civil lawyer. I'm not a criminal lawyer. He was arrested in New Jersey, in Newark, and held in the Newark's FBI offices. And I said, I can't help you, right? And so that's an important point, right? And I'm just super excited to have Melanie join our firm a couple of months ago, just because she's going to be, she's already building out, but we will be, taking on these type of white collar cases, and hopefully you'll never need us. I really do. Right. Hopefully you never say, we'd like to talk to Melanie because I was just arrested. But in any case, we have the attorneys on both the civil and criminal side, and that brings us to the end. We made it, and Melanie, congratulations.
Thank you.
You just finished your first webinar in the debt relief space. Here's a little slide with our addresses. We appreciate you. We appreciate all the listeners. We hope to see you back at our future webinars. We have great topics for you, and look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.